Welcome to Frankly Developing and another episode of our code reviews. This time I picked a project that is an API that is supposed to compute the winner of a poker game hand. It's a very new project, so there's a lot of unfinished stuff, but it already has a bunch of tests, so yay, I like that. There's one problem though, it doesn't work yet, so let's just quickly fix it. And then let's take a closer look at the API design. And then we'll see what we can learn about that and how we can improve this design. I'm your host Frank. As we said, this API doesn't work yet, so if I try to load the Swagger page, I get this stack trace here. And it complains about conflicting method path combination get poker game for actions. So poker game, there's a controller, poker game controllers. Okay, let's take a look. And yes, it says the route is based on the controller name, so it will be /poker game, and the controller is omitted. Now if we do a get, here's the HTTP get. This means essentially get poker game would call this method generate poker data. And if you look further, there's another HTTP get for another method. Now it doesn't know which one to call. Now if you go down, there's a bunch more of these. To fix that is actually super easy. You just need to specify individual paths for this method. So let's say this one generates poker data, so we give it a /poker data, so poker game, poker data path, and this one straight flush, and so on for the others. And we don't need to do that for the final one since it's a post call. That's a different method. It's not the get referred to. And that means once we apply that and then reload, we get your API running. Before we continue on to take a closer look at the API design, please consider subscribing to the channel to keep it going. And also, if you want to have your repository reviewed, just leave a link in the comment below. Tell me what you want me to look out for, and maybe I can consider doing a video on it. So let's take a first high-level look on this. So it generates a lot of poker hands essentially. Each of these generates something. The first one is complete poker data, and the rest is a lot of different hand variants. And that is a post for determining the winner of the poker game. So altogether it looks like this API doesn't have any state database or anything of that kind. It's not storing anything. There's no retrieve this thing by identifier. The typical CRUD stuff is missing. And that kind of puts a question mark on this post, because post is usually supposed to send data for storage and to change this stored state somewhere. Which probably won't happen here if you just determine the winner. And if you take a look at this endpoint, yeah, it's going to take a lot of data for the game itself and then returns essentially who won it. And that is really just a get. It's like you give it some data input, you retrieve something. There's no real thing. Well, that's like borderline. Post isn't that bad here either. Then the next thing is like the schemas. And that's already a bit curious on the first one, like how can you get a not found result if you're not looking up data? So maybe that is just specified for no good reason. And then you have a poker, which consists of this description of the total players apparently and all the decks, which is based on poker decks, which contains players and total cards and highest ranked ones. And the player then has a name, some cards in hand, and a card rank. And what you notice here already is there are a few oddities. Things like the poker deck containing a list of players, but it's named player singular, so that's usually annoying to use. And then you also see that the description here usually has gets or sets something, which isn't really true. It's probably some auto-generated stuff from a property with a getter and a setter. But on an API level, you don't set this name here because there is nothing you input to this API, it just retrieves stuff from you. So why are you proposing in the description that you can set something on these objects? It's just not possible to do so. And on the same naming thing, the overall controller is usually, because we're talking about resources with HTTP paths, it's usually in the plural, so poker games slash, and then you could have something like /1/2/3 or /a GUID when you store poker games actually and update them or something like that. But it's just best practice to have these named in the plural. So let's take another look at the controller and how these things we saw in the Swagger UI come into existence. So you can see here there's a Swagger response on this endpoint that is like, yeah, it can return a 404 with not found result. But actually, since it's always generating data, that doesn't really make any sense. This is probably taken from some tutorial on a normal CRUD application where you can delete and update and then try to retrieve things via unique identifiers that may not be found if you just give it a random identifier. So there it will be a perfectly fine response. Here you can't really assume that you ask it to generate data for you, and that's as well, it didn't find anything. So that doesn't really map well to the current design. And yeah, it's probably pasted to all of these methods. So let's just remove it everywhere. So once we're done and we reload, we can see that this part is gone from the schema. Okay, so let's just commit this. Now we can take a look at the other thing we said about the name of the endpoint paths being in a plural. So that's a super easy change. Just give it the S. That is its own thing, really. You see, it also impacts the test file. So that's why we commit it separately. And then we can take a look at the resulting data that's coming out. And we see that this returns this poker, which has, well, getters and setter for these. And you see the summary seems to be auto-generated. Gets or sets this, and then there's all the X, same thing, get or set with the getter and the setter, constructor that's not necessary, and the determine winner method is on that thing as well. So that's something we should talk about. Okay, so what is that we need to talk about here? When we talk about APIs, and the data models they share, then you share these data models with the outside world, and that brings a lot of complications. So changes are going to be a lot riskier. You will have users of your API. You will have to care about downwards compatibility. You will have to care about versioning. So these data structures that your API tells the outside world, or the usages of your service of your API, that they can rely on. If you have a lot of your internal stuff in there, it's going to get really ugly. So you always want to make sure that you're cleanly separating your outside view from what you need to do inside of your service to make stuff happen. Because the stuff inside, that's in your responsibility area, you can change it, and you want to change it a lot faster than the outside world, which you want to be more or less stable, as good as possible, of course. There will be changes. But there we have all the problems of these usages that might already be in place. So in a tiny toy project, it doesn't matter, obviously. But if you run bigger projects and public APIs, this becomes a serious issue, a very serious one, where breaking this compatibility all the time can make you lose a lot of your users. So make sure to cleanly separate these. And we're going to do that right now. Okay, so let's take another look at this. We have this poker glass here. We also see some interface already prepared, but it's not using it. So if you go deeper to poker deck, and there's poker players, and there it's beginning to get used. So there's an iPlayer interface, which is now much more cleaner as an external facing thing. And we could go back to the poker deck and use that interface instead of the actual poker player, with all its other methods that it might contain with some logic. Oh, it doesn't yet, but we want to cleanly separate it. So let's go ahead and change it. And hold on for a second, I'm not recommending that you do that. We'll talk about that later. Let's just take a look at how it could look like. So all of these become iPlayer. And then if we build it, we have to fix a few errors probably. Now if we look at the new API, we have this one as opposed to that one. Obviously the descriptions need to go all the way up to the interface to match them, and then we get pretty much the same thing. We can get all of these tags in there, and we can get all of these, but now we have it completely separate from our actual class. The only problem, like 2 problems still there, which is why I wouldn't recommend doing this. It's an I player, which is like a C# thing, and the endpoint APIs on the HTTP level are supposed to be language independent, so you don't want to have something C#ified on this, like the I here. Normally we'll just call it a player, which is another reason why maybe you don't want to use an interface. But the more important reason is that you usually have these as inputs and outputs, and it gets really hard with your JSON serialization if you expect the input to be an interface and then need to define a class for that. That's kind of annoying. So usually we prefer to use normal DTOs, data transfer objects, simple classes or even records in C# to do that instead. So let's revert those changes and then work on a more meaningful external model. So we have these models, and we want to be sure that we have completely separated models that are facing externally. So let's separate them and start creating those here. Now if we come from the top, this poker class has not a lot of properties. It has like total players and all decks, which are poker decks. So that will be a simple record where we can say this could also be called poker, like they don't even have to be named differently necessarily. You can also turn it into a simple record. Say this has something like say into total players, and we need a poker deck. So same thing, in the poker deck we will have the players, and we can just transfer all of these properties. We don't need any implementation body, it's just a declaration really. So usually you bunch these up into one file here because it's like all nested inside each other here as one model for the poker in this case. So that's another thing we can do, and then we will probably have a record for the player, and then we just need to fill these with a little bit of flesh on what the actual properties are. Okay, so that's all we needed. And now to not have to change a lot, this is only for the outside facing stuff, so we really don't want to use it anywhere inside, only at the boundary of our service, which is the controller. So now the controller, when you look at a method like generating the poker data, gives you back the internal model from these, well, maybe misnamed card constants, but it generates an internal model, and you want to output the external model. So this poker here, you want to turn into the poker that is in the external model, and then you have to convert this one into an external one. We can, for example, write factory methods, something like a from method where we can take a internal poker. So sorry, this was missing a namespace. So now we can access it as the model that's inside. We can transform it into the external model by saying we need a new external model, and the total players we get from the other model. Now we have to do the same thing for the all decks. Like this is an internal model of all the decks, and we have our poker deck external model, which means we can go through the all decks and basically convert them. Can this be like a list? Oh, it's just one power deck. Yeah, okay. It's just one set. Oh, actually, it's not called all decks. Yeah, okay. So we can do the same thing on the next layer down, and keep going like this. Okay, and once we're done with that, we can go back to our controller and say, okay, to return this, we can just say we want now the external model for poker and convert from the internal model to that and return that instead. Okay, we still get an error that we have to consistently do it, so I'll abbreviate that by just, for the moment, replacing these or commenting out these other versions. Okay, so while on the API level we can't have multiple definitions of this poker player class. It works in C# due to namespaces, but we don't have that on the REST endpoint, so that's why currently only limited to the one we just changed. And now you can see like these classes here, again the documentation strings you need to transfer over, of course, and it looks pretty much the same. Like obviously the I is gone and it's just the same thing as before really. The big difference is really from having a completely separate external model of these classes. And now if you have to change something on these, you know that this is impacting the external world of your service, and so changes here are way riskier but now super easy to know and be aware of, as opposed to the previous situation where it's bunched up with your internal logic and you might accidentally make changes that impact the rest of the world in unintended ways. Okay, let's just quickly wrap that up by making this external model the default on all the other ones as well. And most of the work here is actually the post method, which gets now the external poker model, and we need to convert it to the internal one. So we need to write a few more conversion methods in the other way. Okay, and we're done. We have the big one here again, it's all available. And it's really interesting enough in the calculator window you can see what's going on here very clearly. You get an external model now from the outside world, which satisfies this external model thing, so you're clearly separating this. And you're converting to your internal model from this one, which allows you to call this determine the winner thing. And then you get back something internal, so you convert it back into the external model again to send it out to the world. And all of this happens here in the controller. There's not a lot of other things going on for the external model. It's just cleanly separated to the boundary. I hope you enjoyed this look at an external API model DTO kind of thing on designing APIs in general. If you like this sort of code review, check out my playlist. I have a few more of these that are pretty interesting as well. Thank you very much for watching and have fun developing.